This is David Prager Branner. I'm speaking on the Norman Reconstruction of Chinese. This talk is about Jerry Norman's reconstruction of medieval Chinese, Common Dialectal Chinese, or CDC. He published it first in broad strokes in 2006, and from then on worked it out in detail until he died in 2012. The reconstruction is about to appear in full in a new volume edited by Richard Van Ness Simmons and South Coblin. So what is a reconstruction? A linguistic reconstruction means the restoration of a language that no longer exists. It's normally recovered by comparing its descendant languages. Those descendants variously possess features of their common ancestor, and a portrait of the ancestor is revealed through comparison of the descendants. That's the key concept. Reconstruction often means recovering the actual sound of the earlier language. The study of these things developed in 19th century Europe in connection with Romanticism. But today, reconstruction may not mean the actual sound of language, merely some abstract representation of it. They represent phonology, which means relationships between categories of sound, and phonetics they represent only indirectly. Karlgren, who was trained in the Romantic tradition, believed his reconstructions recovered the actual pronunciation of high antiquity. William H. Baxter and Laurent Sagard, in contrast, frankly introduce diverse symbols for different degrees of abstraction. Here's an extreme example: the Chinois archaïque of Karlgren and the corresponding Old Chinese of Baxter and Sagard. Karlgren, for each symbol that he ever uses, he has an explanation. He tells you phonetically exactly how it's pronounced. Very well, you can pronounce it as written. In order to pronounce Baxter's Sagard, however, you need to process their reconstruction. Capital letters mean something different from lowercase letters. They mean uncertainty, and punctuation marks indicate other kinds of uncertainty or other kinds of variability. They also indicate functionality. The point is that what we call reconstruction today can be highly abstract and even have different kinds of abstraction in it. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that whatever a reconstruction signifies depends on what the reconstructor's goals are. Norman had three goals. He wanted to illustrate a model of Chinese linguistic history that he and South Coblin described in print some years before. He wanted to describe in detail a possible ancestor of all the modern dialects other than Min. That's what CDC was for him. And he wanted CDC to provide a descriptive linguistic basis for reconstructing a prior language, early Chinese. And he had a philosophy that's a little unusual in this field. He believed in only using what he called real words in his research. You may ask, are not all words real? Well, Norman wanted to use basic words, that is, words transmitted through popular channels rather than through learned channels. Popular means of the people. So the channel of transmission is one feature of a real word. Another feature of a real word, because we're using Chinese, and Chinese has these highly abstract characters, Norman wanted to use actual words rather than character readings. So the idea of the reading was important. To take a common example, for the character, the common word that means white in Beijing pronunciation, he would always use the word, what people call the colloquial reading, the word bai, rather than the character reading bo that is preserved in some contexts. So reading was another element of what made a real word. The third element was register, diglossic register. He wanted the ordinary style of speech, what's called low register, rather than the high formal register. Very roughly, that meant colloquial usage rather than educated. So how do you pick real words to study? Norman's goal was to begin with dialects, so he didn't begin with poetic vocabulary or long lists of old characters or rhyming words in the Shi Jing or the Qieyun. He started with a corpus of 3,700 words collected into the 方言调查字表, which is a booklet from the 1950s designed for use in dialect fieldwork. All the words in it are real words. At least they have a very high chance of being real words. And CDC is reconstructed from real modern words. Now, what is the relationship between CDC and the standard model, the model of the Qieyun and of Karlgren and almost everyone who has followed him? So we know that the Qieyun rhyme book represents distinctions between the way words were pronounced in the poetic rhyming of the Sui dynasty and of slightly earlier hands like Yu Xin, 6th century conservative poets. It was fashionable in those days to treat rhyming and maybe even pronunciation itself in a highly mannered fashion. And it isn't clear whether that precision represented the practice of actual spoken language or not. It is clear that the rhyming did. There's no doubt about it. It's also clear that during the Tang, poets largely and increasingly fell away from the style of precision that had been fashionable in the 6th century, a precious style, in my opinion. They had a much laxer practice of rhyming. It evolved into something called the Pingshui Yun, the Pingshui rhyme system, which eventually was favored for shi-style poetry, especially in official examinations. And in the main, Norman's CDC, based on modern dialect evidence, is consonant with the Pingshui system. Not altogether, but in the main it is. And because it's an actual reconstruction, it's not a transcription of the Qieyun. For that reason, it's a very promising tool for use in the practice of reading medieval literature aloud. CDC is the first true reconstruction of Chinese that we have. In order to show you what is original about Norman's reconstruction, let me compare it to the Karlgren model. Here I have 2 characters, 2 words. I've given you the Karlgren reconstruction as revised by various hands, primarily Li Fanggui, and then edited a little bit by South Coblen. There's also William Baxter's typable version of the same system. And next to it is Norman. Norman sees no distinction between these 2 words in the dialects. So CDC simply shows no contrast. There's one pronunciation for both. But there's a subtle distinction in the Karlgren that reflects a distinction in the Qieyun. Now you might want to consider just how would you pronounce the 2 Karlgren syllables differently. The first one is mie. I suppose the second is something like mie. I'm not sure. Anyway, this particular distinction wasn't recognized formally and named until the mid-20th century, and it isn't observed in medieval rhyming either. Much more technical discussion would be needed to evaluate CDC in relation to medieval phonology, as attested indirectly in poetry. But because of time constraints, I'm ending technical discussion here. I think you probably want to know what this thing sounds like. So after the end of the main talk, the slide deck continues with more material comparing CDC with reconstructions of the Karlgren tradition, and also illustrating some of the areas in which CDC is inconsistent with mid-Tang poetic practice or with the Pingshui Yun. So what does CDC sound like? Let me read you an example. I should mention CDC has 8 tone categories, but doesn't reconstruct tone values. So I use my own system for pronouncing the tones. So here is a song. Here is a 4-character per line piece from a Mu Zhiming, a funerary inscription for Meng Jingxun, who was wife of Sima Bing. It's from a stele dug up in the middle of the 18th century in Henan. The stele is dated 514. It's northern Wei. The stele is earlier than when a CDC-like form of Chinese would have been active, but it gives the flavor of the reconstruction very satisfactorily. Muk muk fu nian, jing huo dan shang, lan jiu hui niu, nguk nyun, kim xiang, liang muvun, zoi shit, hui im zhe liang, feng fu rong liat, vam gu liu mia nie ho fu yu zhou xiai zhu qiang sim vun rao yap kon jiak diai jiang. Where does CDC fit in the history of Chinese sound? In various respects, it's a little too simple to represent the rhyming distinctions even of Tang poetry. I mentioned there are more details in the slides after the end of this talk. Roughly speaking, it's pretty good for guqi shi, but there are places where it's really an inadequate match to the Pingshui system. However, unlike the Karlgren system and others of its kind, CDC is a true reconstruction in the linguistic sense. That means that in theory it represents an actual stage of linguistic history, even if previously unattested. It is not just taking an old rhyme book and filling in letters. I said above that what a reconstruction signifies depends on its goals. My goal today is a specific application, illuminating the integrity of literature. And for the most part that means reading literature aloud or talking about words in a form older than Mandarin. This particular older form has more legitimacy than most because of how it was arrived at. In the special case of reading poetry, for the most part I think we're not really looking for maximal distinctions, but for assonance. It's true that in Jinti shi, and especially poetry of the 6th century, poets were indeed looking for maximal distinctions, and to perform authentically we must do the same. But it also seems unlikely to me that those distinctions have actually been observed for most of history. Again, it depends on one's goals. A few last thoughts. Poetry versus speech and the value of reading aloud. There's a problem in claiming that a historical spoken language is an adequate representation of the sound of literature. And the sound of literature is exactly what Zhou Zumo and Li Rong have shown the Qieyun embodies. There's even a comment about this in Quintilian, who obviously didn't know anything about the Qieyun, but he seems to be saying Quintilian is an oratory teacher, that he left a long and wonderful book about language in ancient Rome and the teaching of it. He seems to be saying that fine language isn't any different from ordinary oral language, as long as the oral language is of the same educated variety as the fine language. So I've read classical Chinese aloud. I've tried with my very feeble memory to hold on to it for as long as I've been studying it. I find much to be gained by the practice. Rhythm and patterns of sound become clearer when you actually produce them yourself with your own voice box and mouth. I also have the perception that the different senses of words become more vivid to me if I produce them myself. And I'm not talking now about cantillation, yin song, about which I've spoken often at AOS meetings. That is in every sense an art form, and its practice requires both skill and preparation. I'm talking merely here about reading aloud with attention, something that in Chinese society was a common practice until less than a century ago. That's based on interviews I conducted with native speakers born before the era of the Republic during my years of fieldwork. In reading aloud, most of us have to make do with Mandarin. But there are a number of clear reasons why Mandarin is ill-suited to literature written for the sound of earlier times. Learning a character reading tradition is very stimulating, and in Taiwan we're very lucky that the character reading tradition for Taiwanese language is alive. It's a popular subject in continuing education classes. Even the character reading tradition associated with standard Mandarin is of some value. It was codified in the 1930s and 40s, and it's easily accessible if you lay hands on an appropriate dictionary. But as I say, Mandarin has intrinsic defects in representing the oral organization of earlier times, and this is recognized. Yale at one time had a regular class taught by Hugh Stimson featuring the actual oral performance of Tang poetry using Stimson's version of Karlgren, and it was said to be enormously popular. I would like very much to see Jerry Norman's reconstruction adopted for this same purpose. I think that what gives it particular promise is that it is much simpler than anything in the Karlgren tradition at all. It makes fewer ill-grounded assumptions about medieval Chinese language than Karlgren made. As I say, it's the first real reconstruction that has been made of medieval Chinese entirely from representative modern dialects. My presentation ends here. I thank you very much for your attention. And there's more material in the slide deck, but the presentation ends here. Panel chair, kindly turn this off.